Dr. Shafiq and his team, thank you very much for inviting us. Chairpersons, Dr. Abdullah and Dr. Hisham, thank you for the introduction again. And my talk is on brain tumors, but I start off with greetings from Toronto. And it's a real pleasure to be here in Kuwait. This is a slide given to me by one of my friends. So, for those who don't know a lot about Canada, if you ever come to Toronto, Niagara Falls is just 1 hour away. And it's a great, wonderful site to visit, this particular Horseshoe Falls. It's a better site from Canada than from USA. At least something that the Canadians do better than the Americans. So pediatric brain tumors, it is the second most common neoplasm in the pediatric population and is responsible for 20% of pediatric brain cancer deaths. Now before I go on to my talk, I want to tell you the story of Megan. You know, we sit at our view boxes, we look at MRs and CTs of brain tumors, and we are far removed from the patient. We have this barrier of a computer console or a view box which separates us from the patient. We forget what these children and parents go through when they have a brain tumor. So this is a brave young child, 5 years old. In fact, she died just before she reached her 5th birthday, and she fought an aggressive brain tumor with multiple MRs, multiple CTs, radiation, chemotherapy, and multiple neurosurgeries. So tomorrow when any of you looks at a brain tumor, think of the difference that you can make to a child when you interpret those findings. We do often forget the patient when we just look at MR and brain images. So amongst pediatric brain tumors, what you'll realize is that the most common tumor that we see amongst all brain tumors, that is glioblastoma multiforme, that is extremely rare in children. It's not so common. Meningiomas and brain mets also are very unusual. The specific tumor categories that we often see are what we call as the JPAs, or the juvenile pilocytic astrocytomas. The medulloblastomas are fairly common, particularly in the posterior fossa. Then germ cell tumors, craniopharyngiomas, and several other tumors that we will go through. So when you look at an MR or brain, the questions that arise in your mind are, is there a lesion? Number one. Is it a tumor? Where is it? What is it doing to the other structures of the brain? And what is the tumor likely to do? Thank you. So this is a very easy question to answer. Is there a lesion? Because MR is almost 99.9% accurate in ruling out a tumor. There's only one exception. And that exception is germinomas. So if you have a patient with diabetes insipidus and you don't find anything on your MR of the brain with contrast, and you have no other reason for the diabetes insipidus, often germinomas will start off in such a microscopic fashion that you don't see them for sometimes a few months or few years, so you need to follow up these patients. Age of presentation is extremely important for the diagnosis. For example, infants will often have teratomas and desmoplastic infantile gliomas as a cause of the tumor. Whereas if you go to the age 1 to 5, which is an age where we commonly see tumors, you'll see medulloblastomas and pilocytic astrocytomas. When you think of differential of a tumor, think of a real estate agent. You know, they always tell you location, 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 and the location often predicts the differential diagnosis. For example, posterior fossa, medulloblastoma, astrocytoma are fairly common tumors, particularly midline posterior fossa tumors. In the cortex, it is DNETs and gangliogliomas, whereas in the suprasellar region, you think of craniopharyngiomas and germ cell tumors. In the pineal region, you often see germinomas much more commonly than other tumors. When you think of brain imaging for children, you think of MR as a most important modality. In fact, we hardly ever do CT nowadays. Occasionally, it does help us identify calcifications or a tumor density suggesting cellularity. Complementary things like MR spectroscopy or MR perfusion, we use a lot more in adults than in children, but I'll show you how to use them. Diffusion is important, particularly when you want to separate a necrotic brain tumor from a restricted brain abscess. And that's the only role of diffusion in there. MR spectroscopy is useful when you have a confusing lesion. This is what normal MR spectroscopy looks like, and I'll go in more details of this in later slides. And this is what the tumor signature of MR spectroscopy is, with a low Na and a high choline. Perfusion has become extremely important in adult brain tumors. In children, it doesn't help us so much. Once in a while, it does help us, so it's good to keep some principles in mind. The most common perfusion that we use is T2 dynamic susceptibility, and we look for cerebral blood volumes. And basically what CBV does is it shows us angiogenesis, which is a good marker for tumor grading, and there's very good literature on this available. And just give you two examples of MR perfusion. For example, this is a low-grade astrocytoma, and this is a CBV map with perfusion, which shows that perfusion is low and it's a low-grade tumor. If you have a higher grade tumor, then usually the CBV is much higher. So one important thing that I want to point out between perfusion, increased perfusion for cerebral blood volume, and contrast is this depicts a break in blood-brain barrier, where this depicts angiogenesis. So these are two different things. Don't mistake them to be the same thing. And particularly when you see an evidence of increased CBV, that is a good target for a brain biopsy. And basically, whenever you biopsy a tumor, there could be a sampling error if you biopsy the low-grade part of the tumor. The highest grade is the most better way of saying what the prognosis would be. So this can often help you guide biopsy. So we'll come to some tumors, and we'll start with infratentorial neoplasms. Medulloblastoma is the most common cerebellar tumor. It occurs in the midline, and usually the age is between 2 to 5 years of age. Symptoms are often of a short duration, suggesting that it is an aggressive tumor. Always, when you think it's a medulloblastoma, look at the entire neuraxis, image the spine, because you could miss a metastasis, and that has very important implications for prognosis. This is the classic appearance on CT of a medulloblastoma. On the unenhanced images itself, you can see the increased density because of the increased cellularity of the tumor. And this is a classic MR appearance, again a midline posterior fossa tumor. Anyway, we'll go on. It shows heterogeneous contrast enhancement. And then it has a specific MR spectroscopy pattern, where I'm going to go through 3 slides of normal MR spectroscopy. This is NAA at 144 milliseconds, which occurs at 2 parts per million. This is creatine and phosphocreatine, which is a marker of energy metabolism. It occurs at 3 ppm. And this is choline, which is a marker of cellular integrity and cellular turnover. So when you have a tumor, what happens is choline goes up and NAA goes down. In medulloblastoma specifically, because it's a non-neuronal tumor, you don't see any NAA, but you'll see a very high choline because the cell turnover is much more, and that increases the choline levels. There's a variant of medulloblastoma called the desmoplastic medulloblastoma, which occurs in older people, 18, 20, 25 years old, and that usually occurs more in the hemispheric location, and this is an example of a desmoplastic medulloblastoma. This is the MR of the same patient, showing you the desmoplastic medulloblastoma in the right cerebellar hemisphere. Just to show you metastasis from medulloblastoma, this was a small primary tumor in the midline, and there were multiple leptomeningeal mets all throughout the cerebellum, involving the folia and CSF spaces. Very important again to stress the fact that MR of the spine should always be done whenever you evaluate a medulloblastoma, because the prognosis depends on this a lot. And this is an example of multiple metastasis shown as enhancing lesions within the spinal canal along the surface of the cord. The reason to show you this histopathologic slide of medulloblastoma is to show you how cellular the tumor is, multiple blue round cells, and the nucleus to cytoplasm ratio. The nucleus is very big, the cytoplasm is small, hence you have the increased density on CT, and hence you have diffusion restriction on MR. Is there too much disturbance? This is all right? So the second most common tumor that occurs in the posterior fossa is the cerebellar astrocytoma, and this is about 40% of all tumors in the pediatric age group. Most of them, fortunately, are the low-grade tumors, juvenile pilocytic astrocytomas. Now, these often present in the first or second decade. Their duration of symptoms is much longer than a medulloblastoma because these are low-grade tumors compared to a medulloblastoma. And the appearance is very, very specific and significant in making a diagnosis. So if you see a cystic lesion with an intramural enhancing nodule, that in a child is almost always a cerebellar astrocytoma. And you can see this another variety of a cerebellar astrocytoma as a nodule which is intramural, which partly enhances. Now when you look at the histopathology of a juvenile pilocytic astrocytoma, you will see that the cellularity is not as much as a medulloblastoma, hence the density is less on CT, and hence the diffusion restriction is not there on MR. They also contain these multiple small cysts called microcysts. They have a large cyst and then they have microcysts within the solid components. And this is just to show you the difference between what a medulloblastoma looks like, high density on CT, and an astrocytoma, low density on CT. And this is just to show you the histopathologic characteristics. Medulloblastoma is much more cellular compared to an astrocytoma. And the MR spectroscopy reflects that. One important caveat for a pilocytic astrocytoma is that if you do MR spectroscopy on the solid portion of the JPA, you will see what looks like a malignant tumor, and we know that this is a low-grade biologic tumor. The reason why we see lactate over here is because of the microcysts which act like lactate sinks, so they accumulate lactate, and that's why you see a lot of lactate. The third tumor that occurs in the midline posterior fossa is an ependymoma, and this arises from the fourth ventricular floor and then fills up the whole fourth ventricle. It has a very characteristic sort of appearance, and if any of you have read Anne Osborne's book or heard her speak, it sort of squeezes out through the outlet foramina of the fourth ventricle as if you are squeezing toothpaste out of a small foramen. It's a very heterogeneous tumor. It has much more calcification compared to medulloblastoma. And again, leptomeningeal seeding is very important within ependymomas. So this is what a medulloblastoma looks like. You can see how it squeezes out through the foramen magnum into the upper cervical canal. It squeezes out through the foramen of Luschka into the CP angle, and it has a very heterogeneous appearance with some calcifications on CP. On histopathology, it has these very characteristic sort of ependymal rosettes, which is like a accumulation of cells around a hollow cystic sort of space. So those were the three common posterior fossa midline tumors that we see. The fourth most common tumor that we see is the brainstem glioma, or sorry, the glioma is a little more common than ependymoma. And when you see a brainstem glioma, its location determines its prognosis. For example, if you see a pontine glioma, which is the vast majority of brainstem gliomas, these are extremely bad in their prognosis. In fact, if you see a pontine glioma which looks like this and presents with a clinical triad of ataxia and cranial nerve palsies, and if you see an appearance of a tumor which involves most of the brainstem, expands it, this is like a death sentence for a child. So this is a really sad tumor to have because the prognosis is so bad. In fact, the appearance of the tumor itself is pathognomic, and many times we don't even biopsy these. These are treated with radiation, and most of these children will die within 2 years. So it's a very, very bad tumor to have. Whereas if you have a mesencephalic glioma, that is a glioma which occurs in the tegmentum or the tectum of the midbrain, those are very, very low-grade tumors. And these are so low-grade that sometimes they don't change forever in life. For example, so mesencephalic gliomas are very low-grade tumors. Is this too loud? Is it okay? Okay. So I remember when I was doing my residency, there was a nurse who had a brother who had a small mesencephalic glioma. That was 20, 25 years ago. And that person is still alive and doing well with a simple shunt. So these are so low grade that sometimes we think that these could be just hamartomas. And this is an example of a low grade tectal glioma. You can see a little thickening of the tectum causing aqueductal stenosis and hydrocephalus. And often these are just treated with third ventriculostomies nowadays instead of shunts. In supratentorial tumors, we have astrocytomas which are common, and most of them are low grade. And then we have craniopharyngiomas, germinomas, gangliogliomas, and DNETs. Just to remind you of the WHO grading, that the most high-grade tumor, that is glioblastoma multiforme, and the lower-grade tumor is the pilocytic astrocytomas. So I told you that GBMs are not very common in children, but once in a while we get fooled. For example, this was one patient where you could see this sort of tumor in the left thalamus. If you see the small amount of vessels over here, that indicates that it's a higher-grade tumor. And this was an axial T2 and axial T1. And even juvenile pilocytic astrocytomas are common in this location. So we were contemplating on what the diagnosis, and the neurosurgeons were waiting to operate on this. The MR spectroscopy appeared aggressive, but it did not help us because even JPAs can look similar. And while they were waiting for surgery, this tumor suddenly bled, and there was intracranial hemorrhage with intraventricular extension, and this is the tumoral hemorrhage. And this child actually went on to die, had a post-mortem, and this was actually a glioblastoma multiforme. Craniopharyngiomas are very common suprasellar tumors, and they occur in two age groups. One is in the younger age group, 5 to 10 years, and then in the older adults. So the children have adamantinomatous craniopharyngiomas, whereas adults have papillary craniopharyngiomas. The papillary ones are more difficult to resect, whereas these are a little bit more better to treat. They often present with headaches, but their most important presentation is growth delay or diabetes insipidus. So if you have a child who presents with growth delay, we always evaluate them for MR for a suprasellar tumor. They're very heterogeneous. They have calcifications and cysts. And a cyst, if you were to aspirate the cyst, you get this classic machine oil sort of appearance. And this is what a craniopharyngioma looks like. Even on a T1, because of the high protein content or lipid content of the cyst, it could be bright on T1. It has different appearances of the cyst with different T1 signal intensities, and then it often has enhancing components, as you see over here. This is another appearance of a craniopharyngoma on coronal views, a coronal flare, a coronal T2, and this is actually an axial T1 with contrast, which shows you the enhancing components of the craniopharyngioma. Whenever in doubt, and when you cannot make a differentiation on MR, just do a CT. If you see peripheral rim calcifications, that is almost diagnostic of a craniopharyngioma when you have a suprasellar mass with a cyst, because calcifications occur in about 90 to 95% of craniopharyngiomas. And they have this classic histopath appearance, so often you don't go wrong when you take a biopsy where they have calcium and they have these keratinized cells which are very obvious on histopathology. We come to pineal region masses, and these are about 10% of all pediatric brain tumors. And they present with specific symptoms. Hydrocephalus, obviously, because they can compress on the aqueduct, which is an important drainage channel for CSF. And then this classic syndrome of Parinot's, where there's paralysis of upward gaze and abnormal convergence because it presses on the tectum, causing this particular syndrome. So germinomas, when they occur in the pineal region, have a marked male predilection. And when they occur in the suprasellar region, male and females are equal in incidence. It's a very interesting tumor. It looks very heterogeneous. It looks very aggressive. If you biopsy it and you diagnose a germinoma, neurosurgeons love it because when you treat it with chemotherapy and radiation, it almost completely melts away, and the long-term prognosis is usually very good. Just to show you what it looks like, this is a classic germinoma, high density calcifications, often enhancing, causing obstructive hydrocephalus. This is the MR appearance of a germinoma in the pineal region. It was the same tumor, and you can see how it is slightly low in signal because these are cellular-like medulloblastomas. When you have this appearance, and this is very important for the residents to know, particularly when you have a tumor in the pineal region and a tumor in the suprasellar region, that is almost pathognomic for a germinoma. Germinomas often seed along CSF pathways, and this is a very classic appearance of a germinoma. Very important, when you think of a germinoma, we again image the entire brain and the entire spinal cord because you can have seeding along the leptomeningeal CSF pathways. And this is a germinoma which has spread to the anterior third ventricle and along the ependymal margins of the frontal horn of the left lateral ventricle. So those were pineal region tumors. We now come to some specific tumors which live in the cortex and which cause epilepsy. The two common ones are DNETs and gangliogliomas. Pleomorphic xanthoastrocytomas are so rare that I'll not be showing them to you. So gangliogliomas often occur in the first 20 years of life. They have a characteristic appearance of calcification and cyst formation. And this is what they look like. They live in the cortex. They have a cystic area. They have a nodular area. If you were to do a CT, you will often find calcification in 30 to 40% of them. And they often present with epilepsy. They don't present with neurological deficits. This is the other tumor which causes epilepsy or recurrent seizures, that is dysembryoplastic neuroepithelial tumor. This is a very interesting tumor. It often looks like it contains lots of water or fluid. It doesn't enhance, doesn't have calcifications, and doesn't have any surrounding vasogenic edema. In fact, sometimes it is so fluidish that it could look like an arachnoid cyst. If you don't carefully see this little rim of brain tissue going around it, you would mistake this for an extraaxial cyst. So you can see on FLAIR images, there's a rim of tissue going around it, so this is an intraaxial tumor. And this is at surgery, the expansion of the gyrus rectus almost looks like a mushroom-shaped tumor. And it often extends towards the ventricle, and areas of abnormal signal along its margin is often due to cortical dysplasia. We come to some more specific tumors in the pediatric age group, and there is tumors which occur in infancy. Teratomas are supposed to be the most common one. Then you can have astrocytomas. Now, astrocytomas, when they occur before 1 year of age, are usually higher grade compared to the normal pediatric population where they are low grade. And then you have these specific tumors, the choroid plexus tumors, the rhabdoid tumors, the atypical teratoid rhabdoid tumors, which I'm not going to show you because they're extremely rare. And then the very classic appearance of a desmoplastic infantile ganglioglioma. So teratomas, these are seen often at birth or in the first 6 months of life. And they're from all three germ cell layers. They're often malignant. And children often don't do well with teratomas. And this is one from literature. They often live in the midline. You'll see calcifications. You'll see cysts. You may see fatty components. So when you do MR, use fat-saturated techniques to look for fatty components in teratomas. The choroid plexus papillomas are easy to diagnose because they have this classic appearance. And when they occur in children, they're often intraventricular, but they're often supratentorial compared to adults. So in children, they occur in the lateral ventricle supratentorially. In adults, they occur in the fourth ventricle in the infratentorial compartment. And if you look at this tumor, I think anybody could diagnose it. You see this nice frond-like tumor. This is a normal choroid plexus. This is a big cauliflower-like choroid plexus on the left side, which obviously is a tumor and a choroid plexus papilloma. They cause hydrocephalus in two ways. One is that they increase CSF production, causes hydrocephalus. The other thing is the choroid plexus papilloma is often on a stalk, and in different positions it could herniate down into the third ventricle and obstruct flow of CSF. So keep that in mind. They have a very classic pathology where they have one fibrovascular core and they have a single layer of columnar epithelium, as you can see on this slide. So it's a straightforward diagnosis on histopathology. Now, very rarely you could have choroid plexus carcinomas, and these obviously, compared to the choroid plexus papillomas, look more aggressive. They invade the brain and they cause vasogenic edema. And this is a classic appearance of a choroid plexus carcinoma that we had. This is a patient who presented. This is from about 1 year ago, and this patient did not survive for long. Then we have this very characteristic tumor called the desmoplastic infantile ganglioglioma. It presents as a huge hemispheric cyst and peripheral enhancing nodules. It looks very big and looks very dangerous, but often when you resect these tumors, you can completely take them out, and they have a very good long-term prognosis. And in spite of its very big appearance, as you can see on this FLAIR and on this axial T2, and on these contrast-enhanced images, you can see the peripheral rim of enhancement and nodules. You can completely excise this, and in the long term, they do extremely well. So this is a desmoplastic infantile ganglioglioma. It is called desmoplastic because if you look at the staining of this collagen over here in green and purple, this is very desmoplastic. It contains a lot of fibrous content. So that was about the pediatric brain tumors. I think I went by a little faster than normal because I thought I was going to go over time. So I'm going to slow down because I have a few slides left. So let me ask you this question. What genetic condition does this patient have? This is a coronal T2 fat sac, axial flare. Anybody? Neurofibromatosis, which type? 1, perfect. And you can see that is the thickened optic nerve on the right side. You can see the optic chiasm is thickened, and you can see these multiple small foci of increased signal, what we call as FASIs, foci of abnormal signal intensity. And this is a classic neurofibromatosis 1. The optic pathway gliomas that occur in NF1 are usually very low grade. They're almost always juvenile pilocytic astrocytomas. And you'll remember that the most common tumor that you see in NF1, in 15 to 20% of them, is a juvenile pilocytic astrocytoma. Compare that with NF2, which usually you see beyond the second decade of life. So in a pediatric population, we don't see NF2 very commonly as we see NF1. We see that beyond 18, 20 years of life. So this is a classic NF2, where you can see the small acoustic schwannoma on one side, acoustic schwannoma on the other side. So for residents, if you see 2 acoustic schwannomas or bilateral acoustic schwannomas, it is pathognomic for NF2. In this particular case, you can see this broad-based meningeal tumor, which was a meningioma, which was extending down into the jugular foramen. So very classic neurofibromatosis 2. So in summary, location, 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 very important for differential diagnosis. In the posterior fossa, think of medulloblastoma, ependymomas, and pilocytic astrocytomas, 3 tumors. In the supratentorial hemispheric region, astrocytomas, of course, but think of pinnats, ATRTs, and sometimes, very rarely, ependymomas. The 2 classic cortical tumors that we showed you, the DNETs and the gangliogliomas. The suprasellar tumors, craniopharyngioma, germ cell tumor, and the hypothalamic or the optic chiasm glioma. And in the pineal region, think of the germ cell tumor, which is much more common than a pineoblastoma or a pineocytoma. So in summary, I showed you some very classic appearances of what tumors should look like in textbooks, but you must have heard this being said very often, that tumors don't read textbooks, so there are always exceptions to the rule. So sometimes you will see an ependymoma which looks like a medulloblastoma, or a medulloblastoma which looks like an ependymoma. But you can't help it because you have to go by what is more common in life and sort of have a common and sensible approach to diagnosing and managing these tumors. I wanted to acknowledge Dr. Laughlin, who is one of my colleagues. We often go to neuro-oncology rounds and share those rounds together every Thursday evening from 5 to 6:30. And Dr. Bill Halliday, who's a very good friend of mine, he's a neuropathologist. We often travel together in the morning, and he lends me some of his histopathologic knowledge. So to end, just to showing you a view of the Niagara Falls as you see it in the night with lights. And this is actually the American side of the falls. You can see it's a straight line compared to the more beautiful U-shaped falls from the Canadian side. So again, plugging for Canada. Thank you very much.